The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder as the sun began to rise over the Maryland countryside. It was September in the year 1862, and the cornfield near Sharpsburg was about to become a slaughterhouse. Thousands of soldiers clad in blue and gray stood ready to unleash hell upon one another in what would become the single bloodiest day in the history of the United States. The deafening roar of artillery shattered the morning silence as cannonballs tore through the rows of corn. Men fell in droves, and the green stalks were painted red with the blood of American youth. This was not a foreign war, but a family feud turned deadly. The survival of the United States hung in the balance on this foggy morning. A victory for the Confederate States of America might convince European powers like Great Britain and France to intervene and recognize the rebellion as a legitimate nation. Such an act would likely seal the doom of the Union and permanently divide the North American continent. The experiment of democracy initiated by the Founding Fathers was facing its ultimate test. Every soldier on that field carried the weight of history on his shoulders. The fate of millions of enslaved people also depended on the outcome of this terrible struggle. There was no room for error on this day. In the White House nearly 70 miles away, Abraham Lincoln paced the floor with a heavy heart. He was a man of humble origins who had risen to the highest office in the land, only to see the nation tear itself apart. His face was etched with deep lines of worry, and his eyes held a profound sadness that seemed to mirror the suffering of the country. Lincoln knew that he needed a military victory to issue a proclamation that would change the purpose of the war. He was waiting for news from the front lines while the telegraph wires remained silent. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier. The question plaguing the mind of the president and the public alike was whether the Union could be preserved at all. Could a government of the people by the people and for the people endure such a catastrophic internal fracture? The military leadership of the North had been plagued by hesitation and incompetence, while the South seemed to possess brilliant tactical commanders. If the Army of the Potomac failed to stop the invasion of the North, the Confederate Army could march on Washington city itself. The capital was vulnerable, and panic was beginning to spread through the streets. The outcome of the war was far from certain. To understand this moment of crisis, we must look back to the election of 1860. The political landscape of the United States was fractured beyond repair over the issue of slavery and its expansion into new territories. The Republican Party had nominated Abraham Lincoln, who was viewed by the Southern states as a radical abolitionist despite his moderate public stance. When the votes were counted, Lincoln had won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. The result sent a shockwave through the slaveholding South. They believed their way of life and their economic system were under direct threat from the incoming administration. The reaction was swift and uncompromising, as South Carolina became the first state to dissolve its union with the United States in December of 1860. Fire eaters and secessionists cheered in the streets of Charleston, believing they were embarking on a second American Revolution. Within months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. They formed a new government called the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Finis Davis as their president. The departing senators and representatives left the halls of Congress in Washington with dramatic speeches of defiance. The nation was effectively split in two before Lincoln even took the oath of office. Tensions reached a boiling point in Charleston Harbor at a fortification known as Fort Sumter. The Union garrison inside the fort was running low on supplies and refused to surrender to the surrounding Confederate artillery. On the morning of April 12, 1861, the Confederate batteries opened fire. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the brick fortress until the Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, was forced to capitulate. Remarkably, no one was killed during the bombardment, but the psychological impact was devastating. The flag of the United States had been fired upon and lowered in surrender. The war had officially begun. President Abraham Lincoln responded immediately by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This proclamation forced the states of the Upper South to choose sides. Unwilling to take up arms against their southern neighbors, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded and joined the Confederacy. The loss of Virginia was a particularly severe blow to the Union, as it was the most populous and industrial state in the South. It also meant that the home of Robert Edward Lee, the most promising officer in the United States Army, was now enemy territory. Lee famously declined command of the Union Army to fight for his home state. The first major land battle occurred in July of 1861 near a stream called Bull Run in Virginia. Civilians from Washington City rode out in carriages with picnic baskets, expecting to watch a quick and decisive Union victory that would end the rebellion in a single afternoon. They were woefully mistaken. The inexperienced armies clashed in a confused and bloody engagement. Confederate General Thomas Jonathan Jackson stood his ground so firmly that he earned the nickname Stonewall. The Union lines broke and the soldiers fled in a chaotic retreat back to the capital. The illusion of a short war vanished instantly. Both sides realized they were in for a long and grueling conflict. The nature of warfare had changed dramatically since the days of Napoleon Bonaparte. The introduction of the rifled musket meant that soldiers could hit targets with accuracy from hundreds of yards away. Old tactics of massed infantry charges against fortified positions became suicidal, yet generals on both sides were slow to adapt. The casualty lists began to grow at a terrifying rate. Disease also ravaged the camps, killing twice as many men as bullets or cannon fire. It was a time of suffering unlike anything the continent had ever seen. While the eyes of the nation were fixed on the stalemate in Virginia, significant events were unfolding in the Western theater. A quiet and unassuming Union general named Ulysses Simpson Grant began to make a name for himself. He captured 2 strategic forts on the rivers of Tennessee, earning the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. His victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson opened up the Deep South to Union invasion. Unlike the cautious generals in the East, Grant understood that the key to victory was relentless pressure on the enemy. He was a man who fought to win. The savagery of the war escalated at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. The Confederate Army launched a surprise attack on Grant's forces near a small log church in Tennessee. The fighting was ferocious, particularly in a dense thicket of oak and underbrush that became known as the Hornet's Nest. Bullets buzzed through the air like angry insects, and the sound of battle was deafening. Men fought hand to hand with bayonets and clubbed muskets. The Union line held by a thread until reinforcements arrived during the night. The next day, Grant launched a counterattack that drove the Confederates from the field. The aftermath of Shiloh shocked the American public to its core. More than 23,000 men were killed or wounded in 2 days of fighting, which was more than all previous American wars combined. The newspapers published long lists of the dead, and communities across the North and South went into mourning. The sheer scale of the slaughter made it clear that this war would require total mobilization of national resources. There would be no compromise and no easy peace. The goal was no longer just to suppress a rebellion, but to conquer a determined enemy. Back in the East, the Union Army of the Potomac was under the command of George Brinton McClellan. He was a brilliant organizer who built a magnificent fighting force, but he was paralyzed by caution on the battlefield. He launched a massive amphibious operation known as the Peninsula Campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. He moved his army to within sight of the church spires of the city, but hesitated to launch the final assault. He constantly overestimated the size of the enemy forces and demanded more reinforcements from Washington. His delay gave the Confederates time to reorganize. It was during this moment of crisis for the Confederacy that General Robert Edward Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was an aggressive and audacious tactician who believed in seizing the initiative. He launched a series of counterattacks known as the 7 Days Battles. Despite being outnumbered, Lee maneuvered his forces brilliantly and drove McClellan away from Richmond. The Union Army was forced to retreat down the peninsula in humiliation. Lee had saved the capital and established himself as a legendary commander in the eyes of the South. The war in Virginia would continue. Emboldened by his success, Lee moved north to strike at Union forces before they could regroup. At the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, he achieved another stunning victory. Through a combination of deception and speed, the Confederates crushed the Union Army and sent them reeling back toward Washington once again. The morale of the North sank to a new low. It seemed that despite their superior numbers and industrial might, the Union could not defeat the inspired soldiers of the South. Lee saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow on Northern soil. This brings us back to the cornfields of Antietam in September of 1862. Lee led his army across the Potomac River into Maryland, hoping to gather supplies and volunteers. He also hoped a victory on Union soil would bring foreign recognition. But a Union soldier found a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars. Armed with this intelligence, George Brinton McClellan moved to intercept him. The two armies collided at Sharpsburg in a battle of sheer attrition. The fighting raged for 12 hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The Battle of Antietam ended in a tactical draw, but it was a strategic victory for the Union because Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia. This gave Abraham Lincoln the political cover he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states were to be free. It transformed the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. This masterstroke also made it impossible for Britain or France to support the Confederacy without appearing to support the institution of slavery. Despite the moral victory, the military situation remained grim for the North. In December of 1862, the new Union commander Ambrose Everett Burnside launched a disastrous assault at Fredericksburg, Virginia. He ordered his troops to attack a fortified Confederate position on Marye's Heights. Wave after wave of Union soldiers charged up the hill, only to be mowed down by Confederate riflemen protected by a stone wall. It was a futile waste of life that left thousands of blue-clad bodies freezing on the slopes. Robert Edward Lee, watching the carnage, famously remarked that it is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it. The spring of 1863 brought another humiliation for the Union at the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Union Army was now led by Joseph Hooker, who devised a sound plan to trap Lee. However, Lee defied military convention by splitting his smaller army in the face of a superior force. He sent Stonewall Jackson on a daring flank march that caught the Union troops completely by surprise. The Confederates rolled up the Union line and won a spectacular victory. It was considered Lee's masterpiece, but it came at a terrible cost. In the confusion of the twilight battle, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men while scouting the lines. He died of pneumonia a few days later, depriving Lee of his most trusted subordinate. The loss of Jackson was a blow from which the Army of Northern Virginia would never fully recover. Lee felt he had lost his right arm. Nevertheless, the Confederates were riding a wave of confidence. Lee decided to gamble everything on a second invasion of the North, hoping to force a peace settlement. He turned his army toward Pennsylvania. The two massive armies blindly groped for one another across the rolling hills of southern Pennsylvania. The new Union commander, George Gordon Meade, moved his forces to shield major cities while tracking Lee's movements. On the morning of July 1, 1863, advance units from both sides stumbled into each other near the small market town of Gettysburg. What began as a minor skirmish over shoes and supplies quickly escalated as reinforcements poured in from all directions. The Confederates drove the Union defenders back through the town, but the Union troops rallied on the high ground south of the city. The second day of Gettysburg saw furious fighting as Lee launched attacks on both ends of the Union line. The most critical moment occurred at a rocky hill known as Little Round Top on the extreme left flank of the Union Army. A regiment from Maine led by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ran out of ammunition while defending the hill. In a desperate move, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that swept the Confederates down the slope and saved the Union line from collapsing. The bravery of those men likely saved the entire army from destruction. On the third day, Robert Edward Lee made a fateful decision. Believing the Union center was weak, he ordered a massive frontal assault by 15,000 men. This attack became known as Pickett's Charge. The Confederate soldiers marched across a mile of open ground under withering artillery and rifle fire. It was a display of incredible courage and tragic futility. They reached the Union wall but were repulsed with horrific casualties. The remnants of the Confederate force stumbled back to their lines, leaving thousands of their comrades dead or dying on the field. Gettysburg was the high water mark of the Confederacy. Lee retreated back to Virginia, never to invade the North again. At the exact same time, 1,000 miles away, another major victory was unfolding. Ulysses Simpson Grant had been laying siege to the strategic city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River for weeks. The Confederate defenders and civilians were trapped inside, starving and reduced to eating rats and mules. On July 4, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The Mississippi River was now completely in Union hands, cutting the Confederacy in two. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the turning point of the war. The momentum had shifted decisively to the north. Yet the fighting was far from over. In the autumn of 1863, the armies clashed in the dense forests of Georgia at the Battle of Chickamauga. It was a rare Confederate victory in the West, but the Union Army retreated to the city of Chattanooga, where they were besieged. Grant was summoned to save the situation. He arrived, took command, and broke the siege in a series of dramatic battles, including a charge up Missionary Ridge. Impressed by his success, Abraham Lincoln promoted Ulysses Simpson Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies in March of 1864. Lincoln had finally found a general who could match Lee. Grant devised a strategy of simultaneous attacks across all fronts to prevent the Confederates from shifting troops. He would accompany the Army of the Potomac in Virginia to face Lee directly, while General William Tecumseh Sherman would advance into Georgia. Grant's orders were simple. He told Meade that wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. The confrontation between Grant and Lee began in May of 1864 in a dense tangle of second-growth forest known as the Wilderness. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with the woods catching fire and burning, many wounded men alive. Unlike previous Union generals who retreated after a bloody battle, Grant ordered his army to march south toward Richmond. The soldiers cheered when they realized they were not turning back. Grant was determined to grind down Lee's army through a war of attrition, regardless of the cost in human life. The armies clashed again at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where they fought for 20 hours straight in pouring rain at a bend in the trenches known as the Bloody Angle. The combat was hand-to-hand, and so intense that oak trees were cut down by the sheer volume of rifle fire. Bodies piled up in the mud as men fought with desperation. Grant sent a message to Washington declaring that he proposed to fight it out on this line if it took all summer. The casualty lists in the North were horrifying, and Grant was labeled a butcher by some newspapers. The relentless offensive continued to Cold Harbor, where Grant launched a frontal assault against entrenched Confederate positions. 7,000 Union soldiers fell in less than 30 minutes. It was a lopsided slaughter that Grant would later regret more than any other order he gave. Despite the losses, he continued to move south, pinning Lee's army down. He eventually crossed the James River and laid siege to the vital railroad hub of Petersburg, just south of Richmond. The war in Virginia settled into a grim stalemate of trench warfare that foreshadowed the conflicts of the 20th century. While Grant held Lee at Petersburg, William Tecumseh Sherman was maneuvering against the Confederate Army in Georgia. Sherman captured the industrial hub of Atlanta in September of 1864. This victory was crucial as it boosted Northern morale just in time for the presidential election. Sherman then made a bold decision. He cut his supply lines and marched his army of 60,000 men across Georgia to the sea. His goal was to destroy the economic and psychological will of the South to fight. His troops foraged for food and destroyed railroads, factories, and plantations. The election of 1864 was a referendum on the war. The Democrats nominated George Brinton McClellan, the former general, on a peace platform that would have likely resulted in Confederate independence. However, the fall of Atlanta and the determination of the Union soldiers who voted in the field secured a landslide victory for Abraham Lincoln. His re-election signaled to the South that the North would not give up. The Confederacy was running out of men, food, and hope. The end was drawing near. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate lines at Petersburg were stretched to the breaking point. On April 2nd, Grant launched a massive assault that finally broke through. The Confederate government fled Richmond, setting fires to warehouses as they left. The Union Army entered the Confederate capital the next day. African American troops were among the first to march into the city, cheered by the liberated populace. Abraham Lincoln himself visited Richmond, walking the streets with his son and sitting in Jefferson Davis's chair. Robert Edward Lee attempted to escape west with the remnants of his starving army, hoping to join forces with other Confederate units. But Grant's forces moved with incredible speed, cutting off every avenue of retreat. Finally, on April 9, 1865, near the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee found himself surrounded. He realized that further resistance was futile. He famously stated that there was nothing left for him to do but go and see General Grant, and he would rather die 1,000 deaths. The two generals met in the parlor of the Wilmer McLean home to discuss the terms of surrender. It was a poignant scene. Lee, the aristocrat in his immaculate gray uniform, and Grant, the Midwesterner, in a mud-spattered private's coat. Grant offered generous terms. The Confederate soldiers would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason. They were allowed to keep their horses to plow their fields for the spring planting. Grant also ordered rations to be distributed to the starving Confederate troops. It was a moment of dignity and reconciliation. News of the surrender sent waves of jubilation throughout the North. Cannons boomed in celebration and flags waved from every window. The long nightmare was finally over. But the joy was destined to be short-lived. On the evening of April 14th, barely 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. A famous actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box. He fired a single shot from a Derringer pistol into the back of Lincoln's head. The president was carried across the street to a boarding house where he died the next morning. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln plunged the nation from the height of triumph into the depths of despair. It was the first time an American president had been murdered. Booth was hunted down and killed by Union cavalry in a burning barn in Virginia. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour was gone. His vision of a lenient Reconstruction died with him, leaving the future of the South uncertain. Lincoln's body was placed on a funeral train that retraced his journey from Springfield to Washington. Millions of Americans lined the railroad tracks day and night to pay their respects. They stood in silence with heads bowed as the train passed by. It was a collective outpouring of grief that united the North in mourning. The great emancipator had become a martyr for the Union cause. His words at Gettysburg about a new birth of freedom would echo through the generations. The cost of the American Civil War was staggering. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died from combat, starvation, and disease. This number was nearly equal to the total American fatalities in the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II combined. The South was devastated, with its economy in ruins and its social structure overturned. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out. The scars of the conflict would take decades to heal. Yet out of the ashes of war came a profound transformation. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in December of 1865, forever abolishing slavery in the United States. 4 million people were freed from bondage. The supremacy of the federal government over the states was established once and for all. The United States was no longer a collection of sovereign entities, but a single, indivisible nation. The question of whether a democracy could survive a civil war had been answered in the affirmative. The era of Reconstruction that followed was a turbulent time of political struggle and racial violence. The promise of equality for African Americans was often thwarted by discriminatory laws and the rise of terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It would take another century of struggle before the civil rights promised by the outcome of the war were fully realized. The road to a more perfect union was long and difficult, but the Civil War had removed the greatest obstacle to that journey. Today, the battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh are quiet parks where monuments stand as silent sentinels to the past. They remind us of the price paid for the freedoms we enjoy. The American Civil War remains the central event in the American consciousness, a story of tragedy, courage, and redemption. It taught us that a house divided against itself cannot stand. It is a history that must be remembered so that brothers never again have to fight brothers on the fields of America.